Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Jay Heritage Center's program tonight, a conversation with Maggie Haberman. I'm Kevin Peraino. I'm the executive director of the Jay Heritage Center. And if you haven't been to the Jay Heritage Center, please come visit. It's a beautiful site. It's a 23-acre estate on the shore of Long Island Sound. It was once the home of the founding father, John Jay. And these days, we're an education center. We do programs in history, social justice, environmental stewardship, and a lot of other things. We've got a program next week, a week from now at this time, with the Pulitzer Prize winner, Stacy Schiff, who wrote a book about Sam Adams. That should be a really good program. And if you want to hear more about our programs, you can go to our website, sign up for our newsletter. That's the best way to find out about them and see our full schedule for this year. Our guest tonight is Maggie Haberman. She spent the last 8 years at the New York Times. I mean, frankly, if you don't know who Maggie Haberman is, you're not reading the newspaper, frankly, or watching TV or anything else. She had, in 2016, she had 599 stories in the New York Times, it is said, and she averages maybe a story a day. There were times during the pandemic, I think I saw 3 or 4 stories on the front page of the Times, which is amazing. The 45th president of the United States has called her a, quote, unprofessional hack, a, quote, terrible, dishonest reporter. He's called her a third-rate reporter who I don't speak to and have nothing to do with. And my personal favorite, he complained that she wears smudged eyeglasses, which they look pretty unsmudged to me. He's also said, quote, I love being with her. She's like my psychiatrist. Maggie Haberman, thank you for that. And thanks for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me. And I hope you will all who are tuning in forgive me for my surroundings. But I ended up having to travel today by car and ended up in a snowstorm in New York and got a bit detoured. So hello from beautiful Batavia, and not quite where I expected to be joining you from. So this is not my normal background. So I apologize if you hear people in the background, but I'm thrilled to be with you, and I'm thrilled to talk about all things current events.
So thank you for joining us. So he said all these things about you. Why does he keep talking to you?
So to be clear, I haven't spoken to him since September 2021. Which is when I did my last interview for Confidence Man, my book about him. A few months later, I made public reporting I had developed as I was working on the book that he had been flushing torn up documents down toilets in the White House and on overseas trips while he was president. He got very angry, issued a statement calling me maggot. So that was, one iteration. But in general, 2 things. He craves attention generally, but also specifically from the media, more than any politician that I have ever covered. And I've been doing this since 1996. And he is very, very focused on the New York Times. So what seems like a focus on me, I think, is really just that I'm the person who has covered him the longest and the most from the paper that he has been obsessed with since the 1970s.
Okay. You've called him a shrunken presence now in the, at this time. The conventional wisdom, I think, after the midterms is that it would be more difficult for him to win. What do you think? I mean, is it still possible? Are people underestimating him again?
I think people are underestimating him. I don't think that means people should overstate him. And what I mean by that is he is a diminished presence in our public consciousness and in our discourse. That doesn't mean he will stay that way. He's going to go do events in South Carolina and New Hampshire. On Saturday, he has been effectively, and I've said this before, walking for president since November. It reminds me a little bit of Fred Thompson when he got into the campaign in 2008, although Trump's goal in being the first out of the gate was to try to essentially freeze the field and keep anybody from coming after him. And also I have reporting that he sees some benefit to himself in these myriad investigations he's facing in being a declared candidate. So all of that said, we can't forget whenever we write about him that he is facing a criminal investigation in Georgia, in New York, 2 Justice Department investigations, plus a blizzard of lawsuits, which are normally his specialty to file against other people. So I don't know what this all looks like in terms of a Trump campaign through the course of 2023. But I also know that Ron DeSantis, who is the person who most Republicans talk about in terms of having a hunger for somebody who is not Trump, and that is real in that party, DeSantis is completely untested on the national stage. There's a very long history, and not just in the Republican Party, but more recently in the Republican Party, of drafting, sort of the great hope, whether it was Rick Perry in 2011, and he seemed great until he started talking in debates. Mitch Daniels, who didn't run, Tim Pawlenty, John Huntsman. I can go down the list. Jeb Bush, 2015. However, politics has changed a lot in the last 6 years. Donald Trump has escalated and intensified a change that was already underway. So much so that I don't know if DeSantis will face the same potential pitfalls, even if he struggles as a candidate. I just think the desire among Republican primary voters and the activist base to sort of protect a nominee or a front-running candidate from what they see as the people in my business, I think is very real. And so I don't know how that would play out. But you can't write Trump off.
Yeah. I want to remind people also, Maggie and I are going to talk for 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up to questions. And so you don't have to wait for that point to ask your questions. There's a box at the bottom of your screen, a little bubble that says Q&A. Feel free to just type your questions in there, and we'll get to them when we get to halfway through. Maggie, if it's not Trump, let's say it's not Trump, let's say it's not DeSantis, who do you think, who's the odds-on favorite? You hear Pompeo, you hear Pence.
I don't think there is an odds-on favorite. I mean, I think that, and I think that the lesson of, don't decide what's going to happen in January of 2024 and January of 2023 has never been more important to remember. There are options for Republican candidates. Again, if any of these folks get in the race, Nikki Haley seems like she's likely to be the next person to jump in. Tim Scott is still seen as a potential candidate. I'm not sure he's decided what he's going to do. Mike Pompeo, I'm also not sure that he's decided what he's going to do, despite what he's saying right now. Mike Pence, I'm not sure what he's going to do, despite what he's saying right now. I think that it's very easy to talk about Trump not being a consideration, but for all of them, they have to consider what running against Trump would be like. And then maybe they'll make a decision that they'll go ahead. It's very hard for me to point to anyone getting significant traction. I think Tim Scott and Nikki Haley are both seen as potentially attractive options to Republicans for different reasons, and some same reasons. But I think Nikki Haley has left a trail of contradictory statements about Donald Trump just over the last year, or 2 years, I should say, that I think would be difficult to explain to voters. And I think that I think that there's a number of factors that we just don't know yet. Do evangelical voters stick with Trump, or do they look for somebody new? DeSantis seems to be, I know you said if it's not him, but he just looms very large over the rest of this field. So I just don't think we can rule him out.
Everybody, over the last few weeks seems to be finding classified documents in their garage.
Did you find some in your garage?
My wife is trying to get me to clean the garage using it as an excuse, but we don't have any. So how is that likely to affect the 2024 race? Does it all cancel each other out, or are they? I mean, how do you see that playing out?
God, I have no idea. I mean, for a variety of reasons. I know that I'm a broken record on I have no idea, but the only thing worse than saying you don't know is saying that you do know and being wrong. So I just want to make clear, we are in such uncharted territory right now. We have two simultaneous special counsels, one for the immediate former president, one for the current president, and the immediate former vice president also just came up with documents. We will see if DOJ does anything related to that in terms of a special counsel, although I think the circumstances are a little different. Biden is effectively Merrick Garland's boss, and I think he felt like he had to appoint somebody who was independent. And Trump was a declared candidate, which was part of the issue there as well, because they had been investigating Trump, DOJ, related to the January 6th attack and to the documents for many months. But I think there's two separate issues. One is the question of whether there were going to be charges. The January 6th case had always been described, by people familiar with the investigation to me as a tougher case, just directly to Trump. I think you could see various figures in the Trump orbit around that time facing charges, but for Trump, it was going to be tough. The documents case always appeared to be a simpler case because it's directly to him, it's his house. There was a subpoena. The subpoena was clearly not met. A statement was issued by Trump's lawyer saying that documents had been returned. And in fact, they developed probable cause that they hadn't been, and then they found a bunch of documents when they executed a search warrant. So legally, it's a very different case than Biden, which we still don't know a lot about in terms of Biden. I mean, I think that, there's a lot of people who are making assertions about the Biden case, but the reality is we don't know a ton. Based on what we know, it's very hard for me to see any action be. It seems like it was inadvertent. There has not been this obstructive issue with Biden the way there has been with Trump. They're just not the same case. So legally, there's this huge open question of whether there will be charges and what these two special counsels look like, how limited in scope they'll be, the speed at which they'll work. Politically, it creates a bit more of a wrinkle because it's the public. I see clear differences between the Trump and Biden cases. I suspect you do too. The public tends, even no matter how many times the media makes the distinction, doesn't necessarily listen to or look for those fine points. And so I don't know politically what it means, but Trump is expert at muddying the waters, and you're already seeing him try.
You mentioned evangelical voters before, and you make the point in the book, and I should say, by the way, I don't think I mentioned it at the beginning, the book is called Confidence Man. It's a #1 New York Times bestseller, and it's a really good book. I mean, the way this came about is I was having lunch with my high school English teacher whose reading recommendations I really trust. He tends to like fiction, and he said, I'm reading Confidence Man. And I said, is there, what don't you know about Trump? Is there anything you don't know? And he said, there are, and there's things you've forgotten. And what she does is she puts it in context of his pre-presidential life, and that's really true. But one of the points you make in the book is about how the surprising fact of his durable support among evangelicals during his presidency. And I just wonder, you wrote the other day about Pence and whether Pence could, how has he appealed so effectively to that group, and do you think that's gonna last?
No, it's a good question. I mean, first of all, thank you for your teacher's kind words about the book and your own as well. I do deal in the book with the moment in time when Trump was starting to garner evangelical support, and there were a couple of ways in which he did it. And I relied partly on my Times reporting from the time. I learned, that it was published in the paper. I learned more in the course of the last year and a half, but there were a few things going on. He developed a relationship with Jerry Falwell at Liberty University, who was then the head of the school, the son of the famous Reverend. And that was a relationship that, as I was always told, that evolved in part because Michael Cohen, Trump's fixer, had a relationship with Falwell or some connection to Falwell, and helped till that soil for Trump. So that was one help to Trump, because Falwell was willing to host Trump at Liberty, which, there were moments when I covered Giuliani's campaign, his presidential race in 2007, it was, because he didn't really make it through 2008. But there were any number of conservatives who didn't want anything to do with him. And it was largely because of his position on abortion. It was largely because he had generally been he had not taken strident positions on a number of issues. Guns was one. And so this thrice married billionaire, with a history of pretty graphic comments on Howard Stern's couch, was being invited to Liberty University, was very notable. The other was that I worked on a story with a colleague, Tom Kaplan, in 2016, and we called self-identified evangelicals, self-identified in a poll that the New York Times had done, and who identified themselves as supporting Trump, and we asked them why, and the answers were, I'm paraphrasing, but his life is Christ-like compared to Bill Clinton's. I'm fed up with my Obamacare premiums, and I think that he'll make a change. Evangelical voters were a lot like other voters who voted Republican and said they wanted a change, and they wanted somebody who was going to take the fight to to Democrats and to President Obama's legacy. And the fact that Trump had all of these sort of questionable issues in his past did not seem to bother them.
You point out in the book about how you tie Trump's upbringing and his relationship with his father to the fact that he seems to see everything through the lens of race in a way. His father, you point out in the book, was arrested at a Ku Klux Klan rally in the 1920s. The father and son were sued for discriminatory rental practices in the 70s. How did his family background and the milieu of New York politics in general affect his worldview and shape his worldview?
Singularly, I mean, the only other major influence on his life that way was Roy Cohn, his fixer and lawyer, who was a ruthless figure in American politics going back to the Joe McCarthy era, but who basically became the prototype for what Trump thought a lawyer should be, which was something more akin to a mob boss or some kind of a bodyguard, essentially, a reputational bodyguard. But his father was the singular influence in his life. When Trump won the Oval Office, when he moved into the Oval Office, I should say, for a very long time, the only picture that he had on the credenza behind the Resolute desk was of his father. And people took note of that and said, you really need to put other pictures up there. But his father was both resented and feared and respected and admired by Donald Trump. But Fred Trump was something Donald Trump never was, which was a true business success. Donald Trump has had, modest successes in business. One of the problems that people get kind of caught up in is, he's not really that rich. It is absolutely, hard to imagine he is as rich as he claims he is, right? Certainly based on his tax returns and based on other data points. But he's also a lot richer than 99% of the country. And so most people don't hear that as, oh yes, he's not what he says he is. They just hear it as, well, I don't know, he's got a lot of money. Fred Trump really was an innovative businessman. He also knew how to cut corners, and he, milked the government for what he could. And, he came to see the government as something that would take from you. He had been a recipient of a federal loan program and then a housing program at the state level. And in both cases, he ended up getting in trouble with the people running those programs and ended up barred from both. And those were searing events in that family. Fred Trump was also, in the words of Ivana Trump, Trump's late first wife, a quote unquote brutal father. And everybody who knew him had described him as, I talked to people who said he never, at least in their experience, he was never critical of Donald Trump in front of other people, badly wanted to elevate Donald Trump as his successor. But part of that was because his firstborn son, Fred Jr., was not interested in the business, was not interested in being part of it. And Trump sort of fostered this competition between Fred and Donald Trump. And that became definitional for how Donald Trump came to see relationships, both in business and in his personal life.
You mentioned the perceptions about Trump's wealth. At one point in 1990, he had a Wall Street Journal reported he had a negative net worth of $300 million.
Yes.
I mean, how did he get in so much trouble?
Well, look, I mean, he basically ended up, he didn't have no money, but he overborrowed and he overspent, and he spent too much acquiring properties, and he cut deals that were not ultimately beneficial to himself. And they really involved these casinos in Atlantic City. He had built Trump Tower, and he did not have large-scale real estate success. It just looked large-scale because Trump Tower was huge. But he did have these casinos, and he ended up, you know, eating from his own hand, basically, because his own casinos were in competition with each other. He put Ivana Trump running one of them, and she ended up competing with other Trump casino executives at the other casino. Then he gets a third casino, and he turns it into what, you know, it was called the Taj Mahal. It was an incredibly gaudy display in Atlantic City, and it had to turn just an enormous daily profit in order to be successful. And when an analyst, a securities analyst, said that publicly to the Wall Street Journal, Trump got the guy fired. But the guy was exactly right. You know, and Trump got himself in trouble both by actions he took and then by trying to keep people from seeing the actions he was taking and what was really happening. And he ended up in this massive hole at a time when there was a downturn in the industry, in the resorts industry. And his father, who had been bailing him out in one way or another his entire life up until then, helped bail him out then too.
Tell that story with the casino chips.
It's one of my all-time favorites. So Donald Trump, I don't remember if it was late 1990, I don't have my book in front of me, it was late 1990 or if it was early 1991, announced with great fanfare that he had met a bond payment for one of the casinos and was in question whether he was going to do that. I think it was for Trump Castle. And this was a real sign that he was on his way back. What wasn't known at the time until Neil Barsky, who later went on, among other pieces of his incredible curriculum vitae, to help create the Marshall Project. But Neil Barsky, who was then a financial reporter at the Wall Street Journal, found out that Fred Trump had sent somebody to go buy $3.5 million worth of chips at the casino at the end of 1990. And it happened to cover the bond payment. And when regulators found out about it, they were very upset because it was an unreported loan. And you can't have that. Casinos, one of the problems for Trump is that he chose to, and this relates to your question of how did he get into so much trouble. He chose to make his bones in an incredibly regulated business, an industry, which is the casino industry. And he does not like regulation and he doesn't like oversight. And so when they found out about this loan, they were very upset, and the chips were ordered to be secured in a lock box, essentially a safety deposit box, for the casino, because they're not supposed to be used outside the casino. And at least one chip went missing, and that started prompting questions about whether Trump may have been involved. I asked Trump about this, and in a series of typewritten questions I asked, I got handwritten answers in response to. He did not offer anything and said this was not true. But that was how he got himself in that much trouble. And that was part of how Fred Trump helped him out. And one of the things that I think that people don't understand about Trump, because he's been so good at myth making about himself as this outer borough guy who, you know, looked with envy at Manhattan. And that was true, but it didn't mean that he was working class. His father was very wealthy. His father had, you know, 2 sleek cars in the driveway with vanity plates. Trump was sometimes driven by one of the chauffeurs along his paper route. Trump was a child of privilege. And, you know, part of why Trump always feels confident that he should get his way is he's sort of always had a net under him. And I think that gets missed a lot.
You had been covering Trump, you know, by the time he ran for president for a long time. And when he finally decided that he was going to run in whenever it was, 2015, something like that, he wanted you to break the story, or his campaign wanted you to break the story. I don't know. They approached you and you didn't believe him.
Well, what I said was, so just to back up, I had been working at Politico in 2011 when Trump was considering running for president. And that was when he spread the birther lie about President Obama, this racist allegation that Obama may not be a legitimate president, essentially, that he may not have been born in the US. And I saw how powerful that was in the Republican primary in terms of elevating Trump's poll numbers. It didn't get him 100% approval, but it started moving his numbers up in a primary in which he really struggled before that, because on issues he was not aligned with the GOP base in any meaningful way. And so, except, you know, there were a couple things here and there. But I had spent a lot of time on that in 2011, and I had spoken to him a bunch about it, and I'd spoken to a bunch of his folks, and I'd written several stories for Politico, and then he pulled the plug on doing it in the middle of Sweeps Week for The Apprentice, which is, for those who do not follow television, that's a huge week where advertising rates are set, and they love getting attention for the show. So my feeling was we were dealing with somebody who had been talking about running for president for 30 years. And until he actually ran, I was not going to write a word. And so this is what I said when his aide, Sam Nunberg, called me and said, Trump's going to announce on June 16th, and we want you to break it. And I basically said, no, I'm not doing this again until he actually is in the race. Now, in hindsight, not my best call, but a very defendable one. And honestly, the one I would make again.
Yeah. We're going to, I already see there's tons of questions. So in about 5 minutes, we'll open it up for questions. One of the things that I found endearing about the book is that you're honest about your mistakes or your lapses of judgment. You're writing 600 stories a year or whatever. You're, on tight deadlines, you can't get everything right. What do you think? What was the biggest mistake or regret that you have about covering Trump?
I don't think I can isolate it down to one. I would say Anne is, I think there are two things. I think that we did not realize until it was quite late that the 5-borough view of Trump in New York City was not the same as how much of the rest of the country viewed him. From The Apprentice, that was how they had come to know him. And I really understood that only when I went to Iowa at the end of the caucuses cycle, and I was asking people at one of his rallies in Dubuque, Iowa, a pretty leading question, which was basically, "Are you here because the show is going to end?" And they all said they were in a caucus. One guy looked at me like I had 8 heads, and when I asked him why he was going to do that, he said, "I watched him run his business," and so he meant The Apprentice. He didn't know anything about Trump's actual business, and so I think we didn't really understand how he was viewed elsewhere until it was too late. And then I guess the second thing is, I'll give you 3. The second one is, I don't think that we understood that this was the problem with birtherism too. We were doing our job as we had always understood it to be, which is we are calling out falsehoods, people who are being irresponsible, people who are saying, inflammatory things that could be harmful or used by others. What we didn't understand was we were just spreading it further as we were talking about, as we were fact checking him, and covering it. And we didn't understand in 2015 that a lot of what he was saying, about people really forget that, for all the focus about, his talk about the southern border of the US with Mexico, he tapped into a very virulent strain of anti-Muslim sentiment in the Republican Party. And he wanted to ban a religion. And what we didn't understand was that this was popular. This was seen as okay. So I wish we had a better, I wish we had been better about all of the collective we. I don't mean my paper. I don't mean what I just mean all of us. I wish that we had been better about covering the party as it actually was, as opposed to how sort of Republican elites wanted it to be, which was that Jeb Bush was going to be the nominee. And then finally, I wish we had all done more on his business conflicts. I mean, the thing that was striking to me, my colleagues, Sue Craig, Russ Buettner, and Mike McIntyre, and formerly David Barstow, did an incredible work on Trump's tax returns and getting hold of them before, the Supreme Court said that he had to turn them over to Congress. So there wasn't a ton that was new when they were made public by the Ways and Means Committee a couple of weeks ago. But it was a reminder, because they talked about his foreign holdings, just how many potential conflicts of interest he had, that I just don't think that people really understood. And I don't think we did a great job explaining that.
I'm going to open it up for questions. One last one that I have. I mean, Trump had, he said some nasty things about you. He called at least once the press the enemy of the people. I mean, did you worry about
more than once?
More than once, yeah, a number of times.
Yeah.
Were you worried about your actual safety for a time?
I mean, look, I think that he has agitated and escalated tremendous anti-media sentiment in this country in a different way. The press has not been popular in a very long time, predating the Iraq War, but certainly made worse by that. But I think that he gave a permission structure to be aggressive in a different kind of way to reporters. I don't like to talk about, threats or worries about safety just because I think it encourages people. But we do our jobs regardless.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions. You can still type them in the Q&A bubble below. A question from Gene Taybloom. He asked, do you think Trump would run as a third-party candidate if he doesn't get the Republican nomination?
That's a great question. It's a great question. So what I think is that he doesn't really have a ton of wherewithal to actually do it, and he wouldn't want to put in his own money, although he certainly has a lot of money in a PAC that he could use to some extent. But I think he could be and likely will be, if he's not the nominee, very destructive to the Republican Party, unless he sees something in it for him to be supportive of whoever the nominee is. And I don't know what that would be. But he's running a third party candidacy is really hard, and he would not actually want to run a third party candidacy and get 10% of the vote. That would not make him happy. So I don't think he would actually have to do that in order to be problematic for the Republican Party.
Okay. I like this question from Arnie. He says, it's a question about the process of reporting, of political reporting, Washington reporting. He says, how do you or other authors quote all the people when you're not present or have recordings? This is a question about sources. How do you use sources and when you're not?
It's a really good question. We try to get everybody to be on the record, as our baseline. A lot of times there are things that people won't talk about, unless they're on background. I'm assuming you're talking about events that take place or conversations. If there's a conversation with just two people, you're making a judgment call on whether you trust the person who's telling you. I think that people forget how much of this comes down to judgment calls and sort of knowing and believing that, we have experience where the person has been reliable before. And so that's part of it too. If you've just met someone, it's a lot less likely to happen. But the good news is that in the era of smartphones, tape has been a lot easier to come by.
Mm-hmm. An anonymous attendee asks, this is a fair question, when do you sleep, Maggie Haberman? You sometimes, you've been known to tweet 140 times a day. How do you do that? How can you write a book about time management next?
No, I would be the last person you would want to read that book from, as I talk to you from Batavia. But no, I'm I'm a little compulsive, and so that's part of it. But I also, I was talking to my husband about this. My husband's a journalist, and we met at the New York Post. And I had an editor who basically is the one who broke me in, and he, as a reporter, and he said to me repeatedly in 99, 2000, when I was working with him, this is before he was an editor, but he was a reporter, and we were covering the Hillary Clinton, Rick Lazio Senate race. And he kept saying, this is a 24/7 job. Mind you, this is pre-social media. This is pre, texting as a real thing. This is a 24/7 job. And I really was, that's how I came up, and that's what I believed. And I don't really believe that anymore, but I tend to be pretty responsive.
Okay. Sue Druin asks, do you have the same access to the Biden White House that you did to the Trump?
Well, I'm not covering the Biden White House, so there's no way to measure that. I have known a lot of the people around Biden for a very, very long time. But the Biden White House is not as interested in eating its own as the Trump White House was. So you might have noticed there's a lot less coming out about how they all feel about each other.
One corollary to that question too, as you mentioned in the book, somebody, I was always struck covering the White House is there's this kind of uneasy dynamic where when you're covering a candidate, you're covering the campaign, it's actually good for you professionally when the candidate wins, because then you go on to be the White House correspondent, and it just has that strange dynamic. I mean, and you're forthright about this in the book. I mean, has covering Trump been good for you? And if so, it must be it has been good. You have a #1 best-selling book, but talk a little bit about that dynamic, because it must be, it must be strange.
Yeah, I mean, look, I wasn't expecting to cover Hillary. I had covered Hillary Clinton for 16 years, 17 years by the time the 2016 campaign or election took place. But which she was widely expected to win, I was not expecting to go cover Washington. I literally said to my kids the morning, the stupidest thing I ever said to them, the morning of the election, you're getting me back. After things are going to calm down now, and nothing calmed down. It got exponentially worse. I'm very, very fortunate. I have been very fortunate to have had the career I've had, and the opportunities I've had, and I am enormously grateful. But I am the daughter of a journalist, and I am profoundly aware, prior to covering the White House, of sort of what the job, does to kids, and so I struggle with that. I love what I do, and I think what I do is really. I think what we do as a group is really important. We're not curing cancer, but I do think that what we do is important. But it's not something that I was seeking, and it was tough, going back and forth from New York to DC.
Bidgie A asks, even if Trump is found guilty in all the cases that are currently going on, realistically, what punishment do you think he'll face?
It's a really good question. This has been talked about a lot. I want to just say that I think that it's not a sign of a healthy democracy that everyone's reaction to everything now is lock them up. I mean, you have seen this with George Santos, who may indeed have issues that are, criminal liabilities. He's under investigation now, and those seem to be related to his finances. But even before that was clear, reaction about his apparently heavily fabricated resume was lock him up. I don't think that's healthy. But Trump has been under repeated investigation, always ends up protected in one way or another, whether it's by time or by the presidency or what have you. In the case of the first Senate impeachment trial, it's because Mitch McConnell prevented there being witnesses. And I think if there had been witnesses, I think it would have been very, very difficult for Trump to remain in office. But with all of that said, let's assume that he is convicted somewhere. The chances that he ever actually sees jail are not what I think people think they are. Between the appeals process, which would have to play out, between his age and between the fact that he's a former president, I think all of those would work against a protracted jail sentence, let alone, frankly, any meaningful one. So, but this is very much a hypothetical.
Shahid Malik asks about his children, his daughter and his sons. Does he still have their support? There were some tensions towards the end of, throughout the presidency, and especially towards the end. Does he still have the support of his daughter and sons, and how critical is that for his 2024 run?
So his two sons are very close to him. Eric Trump basically runs the business. And Don Jr. has gotten much more involved in Trump's political life since Jared Kushner stepped back. But Jared Kushner, I suspect, will be back in some form or another. So even while suggesting he wants to step away, his daughter does not want to be. His daughter doesn't want the negative blowback. I think that she too will find it. All of their lives are defined by Donald Trump at this point. Jared Kushner less so, because Jared Kushner comes from a separate family of wealth, but his own wealth fund, was clearly built in part on connections that he made while he was in the White House working for his father-in-law. So I think that whatever they say now, I think that they will be involved in some way or another.
Okay, we have a question from Olney Reynolds. He says, the media on the right communicates with its listeners on a very basic level. Is there any concern that mainstream media communications are going over the heads of those who most need to hear it?
I think there is a concern that there is increasingly extreme storylines, things that are just not true, being said in the conservative and right-wing media ecosystem. But there's nothing that, I mean, this has been an issue for a very long time. It has been heading this way pre-Donald Trump. Sort of the idea of the Fox News primary predates Donald Trump. He just exploited it and capitalized on it in a different way. I do think it is important, and I tried to do this in Confidence Man. I think that there's a difference between telling people the facts and telling people what they should think. I don't think people like to be told what they should think. Well, let me rephrase that. I think some people do like to be told what to think. But I think when you're trying to get information across, it's best to be as sort of clear and fact-based as possible. And so I think that's the important thing that the mainstream media can and should do.
Okay. I have a question about Twitter from an anonymous attendee. You're on Twitter a lot. A lot of journalists are. And the question is, how does Maggie view the Elon Musk-owned Twitter as a platform for journalists, as a platform for sources, and as a platform for promoting reporting? How do you feel about Twitter these days?
It's a good question. I think that Twitter can be a great tool in terms of getting people to speak to you, in terms of getting people to can you still hear me?
I can still hear you. Your picture is frozen, but we can hear you. Okay.
Oh, that's so weird. Okay, I'm sorry. I just realized that it was frozen. I'm trying to fix this. I think the Wi-Fi got a little funky. I think that Twitter can be a terrific tool. There we go. Is that working?
Yep, you're back.
Great. I think that Twitter can be a terrific tool. I don't think that in terms of sharing reporting, I have had people reach out to me to offer information because of Twitter, but it is something of a Wild West now, and in a way that it wasn't before. It has been filled with a lot of things that are not, people who will say all kinds of vile things to journalists, and I'm sorry, but this is not the provenance just of the right, for a long time. But the difference is that the algorithm is so weird now that I sort of can't even make sense of what I'm seeing in front of me. And I think a lot of journalists have that feeling. So I don't know what the future looks like. The asterisk is, I anticipate Trump will be back in the coming weeks, and then I think we will have either a more enhanced view or what have you.
One bit of news that came down this afternoon, kind of just before we went on, is that Meta announced that they'll allow Trump back onto their platforms. What do you think about that, and what impact will it have?
It's a good question. I haven't had a chance to look at what the rules are around what Meta will tolerate versus what it won't. So I think that Meta is likelier to be stricter with Trump. I think the big question for Trump is, on Twitter, is does he drag all this QAnon content that he's been posting on Truth Social, his social media site, over to Twitter? I think Facebook is going to be a little tighter in its rules. But look, I mean, it is going to make Trump a potential bigger force again. Our culture is so saturated with Trump that I'm actually not sure what the absence of him on Facebook has meant in terms of people thinking about him, because people talk about him still all the time. The difference is going to be his output and what he's saying. I think it will be important for him for a presidential campaign, and I think that Facebook runs on advertising revenue, and I think they want the advertising revenue.
We have a lot of questions that I can kind of bundle together about January 6th and the January 6th hearings. What effect on the public do you think the January 6th hearings have had, and will they be salient in how people think about Trump in 2024?
It's a great question. Look, I think the January 6th public hearings were pretty effective in breaking through to the public really how horrific that day was, and the fact that it had been, you know, there had been events rolling toward it for weeks beforehand, if not months, in terms of Trump talking about stolen elections and absentee ballots. I think that the testimony from a lot of people, but I think especially Cassidy Hutchinson talking about Trump really, really broke through to people. Uh, I think one of the problems with covering Trump and trying to explain Trump to people, and I tried doing this in Confidence Man, is he sort of hides behind staff. Staff fights with this one. This one gave him bad advice. Oh, we're going to get rid of John Kelly, or we're going to get rid of this one, or we're going to, and it's it's all him. This whole all of these things come from him, and I think that her testimony and testimony from others really showed just how he was the one driving all of this. This wasn't just John Eastman showing up in the Oval Office and sort of directing him. That Trump was really the main force here. And so I do think I think that was damaging. Now, whether that's lasting, I think that really remains to be seen. I think we have seen that the public has a pretty short attention span. So we'll find out.
You talk in the book, and you just mentioned it, and you talk in the book about how Trump has a way, and I think it's something that we don't see, not interacting with him or not being in that room, but you mentioned how he has a way of sort of getting the people in his orbit to adopt his worldview and his modus operandi. Can you talk a little bit about how that process works and why you said in the book you were struck by that?
So one of the things that he does, what I said is that he gets people around him to adopt his behaviors, but that some of his critics do too. And I think that's actually something important to just bear in mind. In terms of the people who are close to him who do it, he attracts a lot of people who either behave the way he does originally or who want his approval. And so then they start behaving like him. He also attracts people I mentioned the thing about the staff on staff violence before. He'll say to one, he's very good at selling himself to people as, God, that staffer failed me. It's really, I did badly because that person let me down. And most people are, built with a certain level of empathy, and they hear him say those things. These are people who work for him, and they think, I could do that better. He got let down. I can do it. And he plays to people's egos that way. And pretty soon they find themselves giving up certain things, or people are drawn to him for power and they're willing to engage in certain behaviors. But I would say that his overwhelming characteristic toward this is just he just grinds people down, and he gets them to drop their resolve, whether it's because he uses other people as for sort of show trials of what he'll do to you, not you, but what he'll do to someone if they don't follow along, or because people just get tired of fighting with him. I remember talking to a former Trump organization aide who said, that Trump used to just talk constantly about his personal life in ways that the person found really off-putting. And I said, why did you tolerate that? And the person said he just sort of, relenting was easier. And so I think that that's where a lot of people find themselves with him.
Okay. We have a lot of questions also about Russia, and we haven't really talked about foreign policy tonight. I mean, you had
No, we have not.
You won a Pulitzer for it, for the Russia investigation into his ties with Russia. Do you think, is there a lot more that didn't come out in the Mueller investigation that you think is out there to be discovered?
I think the Mueller investigation was pretty thorough, and I think that the bipartisan Senate Intel Committee report was really thorough, and again bipartisan. This was Republican and Democratic senators, not the House, where it's much more sort of flame throwing and interpersonal war. The Senate tends to take itself a little more seriously at this point, in terms of, at least on the GOP side, in terms of how it conducts itself. The Democrats also take themselves seriously, but I think they're more in lockstep with their House colleagues. I don't think I think that they uncovered what they could uncover. Whether there's more, it's asking me to speculate wildly in a way that I don't think is appropriate. But I think that I understand why people question Donald Trump's motives when it comes to Russia, because the behavior is so completely not anything we have ever seen with a U.S. president. But he literally stood in Helsinki and sided with Putin over Dan Coats. his director of national intelligence, about whether Russia had interfered in the election in 2016. But I always assume with Donald Trump, there's a lot that we don't know, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's what people think it is either.
How, as long as I'm asking you to speculate, I might as well just go to the wall on it. But how do you think, how would Trump have handled Ukraine differently? I mean, one of the things that's striking is there's so much that you just forget, that, the back and forth with Zelensky, and that's, oh my God, I forgot about that. But how do you think Trump would have handled the situation that President Biden is dealing with now?
Well, it's funny that you asked that, because I've had this conversation with a couple of people in the last few days. I mean, I think that it surprises me that folks in DC don't talk more about, and some do, foreign policy folks do, but just more broadly, Biden's efforts on Ukraine are a pretty singular accomplishment in his term so far. He galvanized support internationally. He has worked relationships. He has been really, really effective. And all you have to do is look at the images that are coming out of Ukraine and the violence, and then you understand why. It was so important. Now Trump likes to say Putin wouldn't have done that. I think he's claimed that Putin threatened to invade Ukraine and Trump threatened to back. I mean, there's just no reason to treat any of that as credible. Everything that we have seen, about Trump and his behavior is that he has been pretty, at least in his public commentary, pliant with Putin. Now, his administration was tougher than Trump's own rhetoric, and on a bunch of different fronts, and that is worth remembering. So I think it makes it hard to predict what we would have seen, but we would not have seen such a vocal defense of Ukraine publicly the way we have from President Biden.
We have a question from Peter Feynman, who asks, Mary Trump says her uncle is an immature child with the emotional maturity of a 3-year-old. Paul Krugman calls him a 14-year-old. How do you prepare for an interview and report on such a person who craves attention more than anyone you've ever covered?
It's a really excellent question. It depends on the nature of the interview and what the topic was. For Oval Office interviews, there's a lot of conversation about what's most important to ask a sitting president. He was a sitting president. Interviewing him for the book, they offered almost everyone writing a book on him an interview, and there were a lot of us writing books. And my initial reaction was, I wasn't really that interested, because I thought, I'm going to show up and he's just going to shout at me, and I don't want to be a prop for him to talk about fake news and everything else he says. But I had an obligation. I felt like I had an obligation to, just especially because the nature of the book that I was working on was very biographical, and even despite him being such an unreliable narrator, he's still the only person who can answer certain questions. So I went and I asked, for the first interview, I asked a ton of questions about New York, and that was a different interview than I've done with him on any other topic. He was engaged, not that hostile, answered, I think, actually pretty honestly, volunteered things that stunned me, including volunteering that the question he gets asked more than any other is, would he run again? Which I was going to ask him, but I said, what's the answer? And he said, yeah, I think I would, because the way I look at it is, I have so many rich friends and nobody knows who they are. And I was stunned by that. So, I mean, some of it with him is the topic, some of it is the setting, some of it is just sort of his mood at that moment. I will say that is not that different than almost any other person you interview. It's just that he can be so caustic when he's talking to you.
Yeah. One of the details that made me laugh, there, small detail, but that I hadn't seen before, is that Trump used to try to tip his military aides sometimes. They had to be
Yes.
had to be told, you can't tip the military aides in the White House.
He just never understood at all the way this works.
Did the permanent staff, kind of White House staff and Secret Service, who are used to covering other presidents, did they like Trump? How did they feel about him? About working with him?
It's a really good. It's a good question, and what you just asked is actually one of the central questions, I think, of the work that the House Select Committee did around J6, which was did the Secret Service like him too much? You know, were agents acting in deference to him? There's still this question of these missing text messages from January 5th and January 6th that agents were sending each other. I think that it's a complicated question, because I think that, you know, from a baseline, Secret Service agents have to get first families to trust them with their lives. And I think that creates just an unusual dynamic. In the case of Trump, I think with some Secret Service agents, you're dealing with people who worked in law enforcement. And I think they felt some of them, not all, but some felt an affinity for Trump. You know, and, you know, that said, there are also, it's complicated again, because some of the people who worked for Trump had worked for other presidents. It's not like they all just came in when Trump was there. And I don't think there was a uniform view, but I think that this question of whether that influenced him was whether service agent whether that influenced how Secret Service agents dealt with him, I think, is an unresolved one.
Okay. You wrote something that surprised me. At one point, you said he had a quote, an aversion to direct one-on-one confrontation with people, and I think of it as very confrontational from his tweets. What did you mean by that?
Well, he likes to fight. He just doesn't like to be direct to you. You know, I mean, he is strangely people pleasing, and so he doesn't like letting people down. He doesn't like, you know, it's weird. And he has sent me any number of angry messages since the last time I talked to him through other people. Mm-hmm. And I have said, he's welcome to call and say this. And, you know, there's a reason why it doesn't happen. So he does not like, one-on-one conflict. It makes him uncomfortable. He likes rolling heavy.
Okay, so when you're interviewing him, you're in the room with him. You don't feel like, I mean, he's not confrontational with you in that sense. It's just when it's not face to face.
Well, no, he is if he's got a huge support staff behind him. So, for instance, I went and interviewed him in either March or April with my colleague Glenn Thrush in 2017 in the Oval Office, and it was supposed to be a meeting about infrastructure, and we walked, or an interview about infrastructure, and we walked in, and he was flanked by like 12 aides on each side. You know, Gary Cohn was there, Hope Hicks was there, the vice president walked in at one point, Reince Priebus was the chief of staff, he walked in, Reed Cordish, another aide serving in the White House, I think Ivanka Trump was there. It was very intense, and he really got in my face, and I pushed back, but and then he dropped it. I mean, that's the thing too, to that point, when you push back, he usually just drops it. So if you don't work for him, if you work for him, you are likelier to hear more.
We only have a couple of minutes left, so I want to see if I can squeeze in a couple more questions. An anonymous attendee asks, how do you think history will view the events of January 6th?
Look, it's impossible. I think we are living history right now, so I have no idea what this will all look like 10 years out, 20 years out. You know, if you had told me that there would be a congressman elected from a district miles from Ground Zero who had been claiming that his mother was down there on September 11th when records clearly indicate otherwise, and that would have gone unchecked, and not even be the biggest thing that people are angry about. If you had told me 10 years ago that would happen 10 years forward, I wouldn't have believed it. So I have no idea. And I'm saying that as somebody who was down on Ground Zero or near Ground Zero when the second tower fell. I covered rebuilding at the Trade Center site for a very long time, so I was really stunned by this. I don't see any planet on which January 6th looks better as time goes on. I think that you are going to see, likely, again, I can't say for sure, likely you will see indictments related to the people involved in aspects of the plot to keep Trump in power. You are continuing to see more people get arrested and charged. There were 2 seditious conspiracy convictions from people, involved in extremist groups. So I think it is going to become decidedly more pronounced how viscerally people view that day. And I do think the January 6th committee is part of why.
Okay, it's 7 o'clock, and we like to keep these tightly to an hour, and we want to let you continue your road trip. We're so grateful for you pulling over to do this for us tonight.
Of course.
Yeah, go ahead.
No.
Oh,
That's the thing. I'm laughing at my setting.
Okay. I thought I would just read. I think it won't spoil anything for the book, but I really loved the last paragraph of the book. And you're describing Trump is leaving Washington for leaving the presidency. It's so cold that the instruments in the band freeze. And you write, quote, almost always there had been a net beneath Donald Trump, but at last, no matter how hard he tried, there was nothing to catch him. No father, no banks, no politicians or judges or customers or voters or his own salesmanship or his power of positive thinking. He had fallen to the ground, at least for a time. And I think, we might have a chance. We might have one more chance, it sounds like, to figure out whether he's fallen to the ground for the last time. But we really enjoyed having you here tonight, Maggie. And thanks so much for making the time. We know how busy you are. We really appreciate it.
I was thrilled to be asked. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Maggie. Good night. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Good night.